Today we're continuing our walk through the faith chapter, Hebrews chapter 11. And today we're going to be looking at a few more of the examples that we find in that chapter of God's faithful servants, the things that they endured, the things that they went through, and hopefully we can find hope for our own faith in times when we struggle. You know, how is our faith with God? You know, are we struggling with faith? And where can we go to find strength to continue on, to be faithful to God? And so we have Hebrews chapter 11, and the writer of Hebrews has written down or shared all these different examples of the faith that these men and women had with God. And we get to verse 32. After he's shared several stories, he says, "And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell you about Gideon, Barak, Samson, and Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others that were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword, and they went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and holes in the ground." And so the writer of Hebrews, he's telling us all these different individuals and the faith that they had, even though they had to endure some hardships, they were faithful. And I just want to look at a few of those individuals and situations that we just read there. And one is that to be faithful in weakness. And in the beginning of that passage, what more shall I say? I don't have time to tell you about Gideon. And I want to take a quick look at Gideon. Gideon can be found in the book of Judges, chapters 6 through 8. And it was at this time in history where the Israelites, they were being overrun by the Midianites, the people of Midian. And it tells us that they oppressed the people of Israel, that anything that they grew, the Midianites would come and they would take all the food, anything of value, it became theirs. They were just overrunning the people of Israel. And so it's during this time that an angel of the Lord comes to Gideon. And when he came to Gideon, he was in a winepress threshing wheat. And that tells us a little bit about Gideon and his weakness, his fear. Because what does it take to thresh wheat? My understanding is they would take the wheat, throw it up in the air, and the chaff would blow away because of the wind. But he was in a winepress that blocks the wind, because he was afraid of the people the Midianites seeing him gathering food. And so he was basically in hiding doing this chore. And it's there that the angel of the Lord comes to him, and the angel says, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Here's this man that is hiding from his enemies, and the angel calls him mighty warrior. And it tells us that the Lord tells him, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand." This man that is hiding, the Lord says, "Go in strength and save Israel." But Gideon's response, again, shows his weakness. He says, "How can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." He had no confidence. He was a man of weakness. But the Lord tells him, "I will be with you." And in that interaction with that angel, with the Lord, Gideon says, if this is true, if this is actually happening, stay right here. I'm going to go get an offering and I'm going to bring it back to you. And so he goes, gets the offering, comes and gives it to the Lord. And then he's given an assignment. He was to go, Gideon's father worshipped Baal instead of God. And so Gideon was given the project, I want you to go and destroy the altar to Baal and also take down the Asherah pole. Again, something else that was used in idol worship. And Gideon followed the command and he went, but his fear, his weakness, he didn't go during the day. He went at night because he didn't want anybody to see him. And the next morning, people woke up and what happened to the altar of Baal? What happened to the Asherah pole? And they found out it was Gideon. And they wanted to correct the issue. But God went to Gideon and he said, I'm still going to use you to save the people of Israel. I want you to go into battle for me, to fight against the Midianites and the other nations that were coming against Israel. And Gideon asked for a sign. He says, okay, God, if this is what you want me to do, I'm going to lay out a wool fleece outside. And in the morning, if that fleece is filled with dew and the ground is completely dry, I know it's from you. And God did it. Exactly that. To where he could pick up that wool fleece and he could wring it out and water came out. But then he said, can I have another request? I'm going to do the same thing. This time I'm going to put the fleece out there, but this time I want the fleece to stay dry, but I want the ground to be wet with dew. And God did it. Because he was afraid, he was weak, and yet he called out to God seeking that direction. So Gideon, God answered those prayers, and so Gideon began preparing for battle. And the scripture tells us that there were 32,000 men who had come together for battle, and they were ready for battle. And it's at this time, sorry, my nose is really itching. At this time, the Lord went to Gideon and said, you have too many men. You need to whittle that down, because I don't want to deliver the Midian into their hands, because Israel will boast against me. In other words, if I let you go with all these men and they rout out your enemy, they're going to take the credit for themselves instead of giving me the credit. And so Gideon, he calls out to the men and he says, hey, if there's any of you that are trembling in fear, now's your chance. You can turn around and go home. And it tells us 22,000 of the 32,000 turned around and went home, leaving Gideon with just 10,000 men in this army. Now again, he's going to go against Midian and other people who had vast numbers, multitudes of people. And so he whittled down this army to 10,000 men. God comes to him again. He says, there's still too many. You still have too many men. So I want you to take them to a body of water and watch how they drink. Do they pick up the water in their hands and lap it like a dog out of their hands? Or do they get down on all fours and put their mouth on the water to drink? And so he takes the men down there, and it tells us that 9,700 men went on all fours and drank out of the source. And only 300 cupped their hands and drank from their hands. And God said, those 300 men, that's your army. 300 men going against a multitude to conquer them, to rout them out. And so God sends Gideon to the enemy camp to encourage him, because it tells us that the Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples, they settled in the valley. They looked thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. And so here's this multitude of people, and Gideon goes, and God gives one of the people in the camp, the enemy camp, a dream. And in that dream, he sees bread rolling down a hill, and it destroys the tents, and they come to find, or they believe, this has got to be Gideon and his army, that God is going to fight for him. And so Gideon is encouraged, and he goes back to the camp and gets his men. God's going to do this for us. And they go back to the enemy camp. And Gideon takes his 300 men and divides them into three companies at different parts around the camp. And with just those 300 men, with nothing but trumpets, glass jars, and torches, they rout out the enemy. They defeat the enemy. And through Gideon's weakness, God showed his strength. And that's the message we need to remember. It's through weakness that God shows his strength. When we are weak, he is strong. And so when we feel that we don't have the abilities, we are weak in an area, we can have hope that the strength is there because God is our strength. So, faithful in weakness. Number 2, faithful in conduct. Another thing that was in that Hebrews passage talked about closing the mouths of lions. Well, speaking of Daniel chapter 6. And it's in that chapter, we read that King Darius is in charge. And Daniel was one of his men that Darius rose in authority because he had exceptional qualities. He could be trusted in everything. And in fact, King Darius had planned to set Daniel up as over the whole kingdom. But there were other leaders there who wanted to find fault with Daniel, but nothing could be found. So one day, these leaders went to King Darius, and they suggested something so that the king would be honored even more. He said, these leaders went to King Darius and said, you need to issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except for you, O King Darius, shall be thrown into the lion's den. So King Darius thought, hey, that's a good idea, and he issued the decree. But Daniel was faithful to God, faithful in his conduct. Even though that decree had been made, he would go to actually right after that decree was made, it tells us that he went up to an upper room in his house where he knelt down by a window that faced Jerusalem, an open window, and 3 times a day he would go to that spot and he would get on his knees and he would pray. And he continued that practice of prayer even though he knew there would be ramifications because of this edict, this decree that had been set out. Well, those other leaders that enticed the king to do this, they went and saw Daniel praying at his window because they knew that's what he did 3 times a day. He was faithful in his conduct. So they went back to the king and told him the news, and the king, distraught at the fact because Daniel was so close to him, he was distraught and he wanted to save Daniel, but his decree could not be repealed. Even though he made it, he could not repeal it. And so they get Daniel and they throw him into the lion's den, and the king says to Daniel, as he's getting ready to be thrown in, he says, may our God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. And that's exactly what God did. The next day, Daniel was still alive in that lion's den, and he was removed from the den. And those that enticed the king to make that decree, who falsely accused Daniel, were thrown into the lion's den. And it tells us that before they even hit the floor, that those lions had crushed them and killed them. Being faithful and consistent in our conduct can have a lasting effect. Because Daniel was so consistent with his conduct, consistent with his prayer life, consistent with his faith in God, God proved faithful to Daniel. And so it would do us well just to be faithful in our walk with the Lord. Then there's also number 3, faithful in conflict. And this is the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, found in Daniel chapter 3. And it's that here was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and it's kind of the same way with Daniel and King Darius. These 3 men had found favor with King Nebuchadnezzar. They had been raised up to be over the affairs of the province of Babylon. And so, but in time, as the story goes, the King Nebuchadnezzar, he built an idol of himself, made completely of gold, and it stood about 90 feet tall and was about 9 feet wide. And when he made this idol of himself, he gave a command, and he says, when you hear the sound of all these different instruments, when you hear the music start up, you must fall down and worship that image. And whoever does not fall down and worship, they will be immediately thrown into a blazing furnace. There were other leaders, again, just like there were other leaders with Daniel, there were other leaders with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego who wanted to find fault with the Jews, with the Israeli people. And so they went to the king saying that there were some people that were not doing what they were told to do. They were not bowing down and worshiping this idol. And it made Nebuchadnezzar furious, and he wanted to know who these individuals were. And he found out it was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Again, people that he admired, that Nebuchadnezzar admired and raised in power with him. So he gave them another chance to bow down and worship the idol. But if they still chose to not conform to what was expected, then they would be thrown in the fire. And I love their response. Their response to that accusation, you have another chance. You can bow down and worship. Otherwise, you're going to be thrown into the fiery furnace. They said, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. In that conflict, they were faithful to be able to say, if you need to throw us into the fiery furnace, God can save us. And even if he chooses not to save us, we're not bowing down to you. We're not bowing down to an idol, for we have the only God we serve. And the king was angry. Nebuchadnezzar was angry, and he ordered the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual. And he had Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. They were tied up, and they were thrown into the furnace. And those soldiers that threw them into the furnace, they were killed themselves because the fire was so hot. But God protected them. Even though the 3 were thrown into the fire, the king saw 4 people walking in the middle of the fire. And so he calls out to them, come out! And they come out of the fire. Their bodies were unharmed. No hair on their heads were singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was not even the smell of fire, no smell of smoke on them. And as a result, God received the praise, even from Nebuchadnezzar. And these three men were promoted to even higher honor. And so being faithful in conflict, when we go through conflicts because of our faith, that we remain faithful, which made me think of the song, Count Your Blessings. The last verse on that, so amid the conflict, whether great or small, do not be disheartened, God is over all. Count your many blessings, angels will attend, help and comfort give you to your journey's end. So even in the conflict, we need to be faithful. And we get that faithfulness from God himself. And then number 4, faithful to the promise. And this goes back to, we skipped verses 13 through 16 earlier on. And so verses 13 through 16, and then the last 2 verses of the chapter, 39 and 40, it says, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. And then verse 39, these were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us they would be made perfect. And so here's all these people, these men and women of faith in this faith chapter. And it tells us all of them, not one of them received the things that were promised. They saw and welcomed them from a distance. And that promise for us is the return of Christ. The promise for us is a new heaven and a new earth. The promise for us is that the new Jerusalem is going to descend from heaven, coming down to earth, and we are going to be with God forever and ever. And we can see it at a distance. We know that time is near. And we can look with expectation of what's going to happen and when it's going to happen. And we realize that our life on this earth in these bodies is just temporary, that we are aliens in a foreign land. But we can remain faithful even during the hardest times, because we have a promise of life forever in glory. And so my challenge for you, or my hope for all of us, is that we will remain faithful to God. Not just in the good times, but in the bad times. Not just in the easy times, but in the tough times. That we will be faithful to him to the very end. And when we see him face to face, the promise will be fulfilled. God bless you. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.